Members of the public angry at the impact the Occupy movement has had on their daily lives are out in force in Mongkok tonight in an intense standoff with the demonstrators there. They have forced their way through the protest areas and have been removing the structures set up on the roads there. Several scuffles have already broken out and the police are barely able to separate the two sides as emotions are running high. Our Ronnie Samtani is standing by in Mongkok with the latest situation. Ronnie, it looks very chaotic out there. What's the latest?
Hi, Sonia. The atmosphere here in Mongkok is intense. Police officers have now set up cordons all around the protest zone, and officers have surrounded the area. But the police seem to be having a hard time separating the two groups. While the anti-Occupy protesters have been shouting abuse and calling on the demonstrators to leave, more pro-democracy demonstrators seem to be arriving in the area and have been chanting for their supporters to stay calm and to avoid clashes. Slowly, police officers have started clearing the Occupy demonstrators out of the area. The junction between Argyle Street and Nathan Road is packed with seas of protesters and several spectators who have been cheering and booing at the police actions. That's all from me. Back to you in the studio.
Thanks, Ronnie. Now, we also have reports that in Causeway Bay, the police have begun clearing out more barricades set up by protesters. We go live now to Liz Yoon, who is on the scene. Liz, what's going on there?
Hello. Hi, I'm right outside of Sogo in Causeway Bay. And around 60 police officers are standing by over here in case any scuffles break out. And the crowd grew bigger over in Scotty Street, and I saw around 200 people gathered over there. And a witness told me some people left right earlier.
And Chief Secretary for Administration Carrie Lam appealed for calm tonight as she expressed concern over the street protests.
I think these protests on the streets have a great vulnerability to turn into physical violence between the protesters and the anti-protesters. Of course, I do not want to second judge the motive of the anti-protesters people in Mongkok. But one would imagine that with a prolonged period of disruption to traffic, road blockages, and also inconvenience to a lot of people, sentiments are running high.
The clashes began earlier in the day and emotions boiled over when the police and others attempted to remove barriers set up by the protesters. Here's our Diane To.
Around 2:30 in the afternoon, some people against the Occupy protesters' takeover of the roads tore down a canopy that had been set up on Argyle Street near Nathan Road. It was a dramatic scene as protesters could do nothing but watch the group of people drag the canopy away. They went back and removed more of the structures set up by demonstrators on the street. This resulted in a tense standoff, and the police arrived at the scene shortly after to separate the two parties. The atmosphere intensified as the afternoon progressed, as more people opposing the occupiers joined in. Police officers held up red rope to separate the two sides, but several scuffles broke out as the angry mob began to push forward. At one point, the crowds parted to make way for someone driving away buses that had been trapped in the middle of the road since demonstrators took over the area on Sunday night. Around 11 this morning, a former policeman had already tried to remove barriers set up by demonstrators at the junction of Argyle Street and Sayang Choi Street South in Mongkok. He said the ralliers should protest outside the government headquarters and stop affecting the general public's daily lives. Several people helped remove some sandbags the demonstrators had piled across the road. But others supporting the Occupy protests then moved the bags back onto the road. Over in Causeway Bay, some people pushed over barricades set up by protesters on East Point Road. Some were frustrated delivery men blocked from making deliveries to the area. With dwindling numbers of protesters around, the police also took the opportunity to remove a truckload of metal barricades from Lee Garden Road. Some bystanders echoed their frustrations.
Hong Kong is not theirs, it's ours, everybody's, all right? Those who helped to build Hong Kong to what they are today, not by going to the street and occupy the road and create trouble for ordinary people.
And while others have continued to voice support for the movement's cause, they also express worry that the Occupy movement is losing the support of people who believe the protests should be aimed at impacting the government, not the public. Diane To, KBB News.
And more news about the Occupy protests. Access to the central government offices at Tamar was blocked today by the protesters. The administration's administrative wing advised staff at the government headquarters not to go to work. Instead, they worked today in accordance with their departmental contingency plan. As Owen Fung reports, while some workers were dissatisfied with the blockade, there were also disagreements among protesters during their occupation.
Early this morning, protesters set up barriers blocking access to Tim Hwa Avenue. They refused to allow 2 trucks said to be carrying breakfast and water for the police to enter the chief executive's office compound. They were suspicious after police vans believed to be carrying crowd control weapons, including tear gas and rubber bullets, tried to follow an ambulance into the compound yesterday. The protesters offered to deliver the food and water to the police, but were turned down by the commanding officer.
We offered to carry the food in for them. And if it was food and they're all hungry, then why do you say no to that? If you've got an agenda, then of course you don't want people to look inside or help out and things like that.
The trucks left the scene, and a few hours later, people in plain clothes brought in the food and water on foot and handed over the items to the frontline police officers. A police spokesman condemned the protesters for denying the officers of food and water supplies.
There are protesters obstructing the delivery of milk and water to the officers and the entries of emergency vehicles. This is inhuman and is obviously unacceptable in all corners of the world.
There was another tense moment this morning when the police tried to bring in an ambulance at the CE's office compound.
We have had one of our officers collapse. I am now asking you to move off the road, please, to facilitate this officer leaving here so he can go to hospital.
While some protesters refused to budge, others wanted to cooperate. The police had to separate the crowd to allow the ambulance to move forward. Access to the central government offices at Tamar was also blocked by barricades set up by the protesters. This man says the blockade aims to paralyze government operations. This woman says she's a cleaner at CGO and demanded the protesters let her go in. After some negotiation, protesters allowed her to pass through the blockade. Occupy Central organizer Benny Tai spoke to the protesters, but he was told neither the Occupy Central organizers nor the students represent all the protesters. The CGO at Tamar was closed for the day, and many officials went to work at the former government headquarters on Government Hill instead.